A millionaire is saved from a fire by his maid, and what she confesses leaves him speechless. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Enjoy the story. The night was unusually still, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch endlessly, wrapping the grand estate of Charles Whitman in an eerie calm. The sprawling mansion stood as a testament to decades of hard work, ambition, and wealth, a sanctuary for a man who prided himself on control. But as Charles sat in his study, nursing a glass of scotch, the stillness was shattered by a faint, acrid smell. At first, he dismissed it as nothing more than the crackling of the fireplace in the next room. But then it grew stronger, more insistent, until it reached his nose with a stinging intensity. He rose from his chair, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling as unease settled over him. Just as he stepped into the hallway, the faint smell became unmistakable. Smoke. Thick, suffocating smoke that hung in the air like an invisible predator. Panic clawed at his chest as he looked around, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Then, as if answering his unspoken fears, the fire alarm blared through the mansion, its shrill cry echoing off the marble walls. Charles froze for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribcage. This couldn't be happening. Not to his house, not to the home he had meticulously built piece by piece. But the evidence was undeniable. The faint glow of flames licked at the edges of the hallway, illuminating the ornate wooden paneling with a menacing orange hue. Grabbing his phone, he dialed 911, his voice trembling as he gave the operator his address. My house is on fire," he managed to choke out before the line cut off abruptly, the smoke thickening around him. Coughing violently, Charles stumbled toward the staircase, only to find that the path was blocked by flames. The fire had spread faster than he could have imagined, devouring everything in its path. For the first time in years, Charles felt utterly helpless. The air grew hotter, every breath searing his lungs as he backed away, his vision blurring from the sting of smoke. He had always been in control, always the one with the answers. But now, he was just a man trapped in his own home, fighting for survival. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman. The voice cut through the chaos, sharp and desperate. Charles turned toward the sound, his eyes landing on Maria, his maid of 10 years. Her usually calm demeanor was replaced with sheer determination as she rushed toward him, her small frame silhouetted against the flames. She was clutching a damp cloth, which she pressed into his hands. "Cover your mouth," she shouted over the roar of the fire. "We have to get out of here. Maria, you need to leave." Charles coughed, his voice barely audible. "Get out while you can." Her dark eyes flashed with something fierce. "Not without you," she said firmly. Without waiting for his protest, she grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the service stairs at the back of the house. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with ash and soot, but Maria moved with a purpose, her grip on Charles unyielding. As they descended the narrow staircase, a deafening crack echoed above them. Charles looked up just in time to see a beam collapse, sending a shower of sparks raining down. Instinctively, Maria shielded him with her body, wincing as embers landed on her shoulders. "Keep moving," she urged, her voice strained but steady. Charles's mind reeled as he stumbled after her, his vision clouded by smoke and fear. He had always seen Maria as quiet, almost invisible, someone who blended seamlessly into the background of his life. But now, she was his anchor, her strength, and resolve the only thing keeping him from succumbing to the chaos around them. They finally reached the back door, but the handle was scorching hot. Maria hesitated for only a moment before grabbing a dish towel from a nearby counter and wrapping it around her hand. She turned the handle, flinging the door open, and they stumbled out into the cool night air. Charles collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath as the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. His chest heaved, each breath painful as his body fought to expel the smoke from his lungs. Beside him, Maria knelt on the ground, her face streaked with soot and sweat. Her usually pristine uniform was singed, and her hands trembled as she tried to steady herself. "You saved my life," Charles rasped, his voice barely audible. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The woman who had always been there, quietly ensuring his world ran smoothly, had risked everything for him. Maria shook her head, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You shouldn't have been in there alone," she said simply, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "I couldn't let you." Her words trailed off as firefighters arrived, their lights cutting through the darkness. The men sprang into action, battling the flames that still consumed the mansion. Charles watched in silence, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. As the fire roared behind them, Charles glanced at Maria, a strange mix of gratitude and guilt swelling in his chest. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to handle anything life threw at him. But tonight, it wasn't his wealth or his influence that had saved him. It was her, a woman he had overlooked for years, who had risked her life without hesitation. "Why?" he asked suddenly, his voice hoarse. "Why would you do that?" Maria looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the flames. Then, softly, she said, "Because some things are worth saving." Before Charles could respond, she stood, brushing off her knees as the paramedics approached. "You should get checked out," she said, her tone reverting to its usual calm professionalism. But as she walked away, something in her posture had changed. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was the woman who had saved his life, and Charles knew he would never see her the same way again. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting a soft glow over what remained of Charles Whitman's once magnificent estate. The mansion, which had been the pinnacle of his achievements, was now a blackened skeleton. Smoke still rose from the smoldering ruins, the scent of ash lingering in the crisp morning air. Charles sat on the back steps of the guest house, staring at the devastation in silence. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched beside him, its warmth doing little to pierce the cold emptiness that had settled in his chest. He had always thought of his home as invincible, a fortress that could withstand anything. But in a single night, it had crumbled, leaving him feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in years. As his eyes traced the jagged remains of the walls, his mind kept returning to Maria, her voice calling his name, her hands pulling him through the flames, her unwavering determination to get him to safety. She hadn't hesitated, even when the fire threatened to consume them both. Charles let out a long breath, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He wasn't used to being saved. He had spent his life as the one in control, the one others relied on. Yet last night it had been Maria, quiet, unassuming Maria, who had stepped up and risked everything for him. The thought both humbled and unsettled him. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Maria carrying a tray with fresh tea and toast, her expression calm despite the exhaustion etched into her features. She still wore the same singed uniform from the night before, though she had wiped most of the soot from her face. "I thought you might need something to eat," she said softly, setting the tray down on the step beside him. Her voice was steady, but there was a hesitance in her movements, as if she wasn't sure where she stood now. Charles looked at her, his gratitude bubbling to the surface in a way that felt almost overwhelming. "Maria," he began, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "I don't even know where to start. You saved my life." Maria glanced down, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I just did what anyone would have done," she said, her tone modest. but the way her hands fidgeted with the edge of her apron betrayed her discomfort. "No," Charles said firmly, leaning forward. "You didn't just do what anyone would have done. You could have run. You could have saved yourself. But you didn't." He paused, his gaze softening. "Why, Maria? Why did you come back for me?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the tray, her fingers still gripping the fabric of her apron. Finally, she said, "Because I couldn't just leave you there. You've always taken care of this house, of everyone in it. I couldn't stand the thought of something happening to you." Her words were simple, but they struck Charles deeply. He had always thought of himself as the provider, the one who looked after everyone else. The idea that someone cared enough to risk their life for him felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, searching for the right words. "Maria, I don't think I've ever properly thanked you for everything you do here. I've taken you for granted, and that's something I'll never do again." Maria's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time, he noticed the depth in them, an emotion he couldn't quite name. She gave him a small, hesitant smile. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Whitman. I'm just glad you're okay." "Charles," he corrected gently. "After everything, I think you've earned the right to call me Charles." Her cheeks flushed slightly, and she nodded. "All right, Charles," she said, the name unfamiliar on her tongue. The two sat in silence for a while, the ruins of the mansion standing as a stark backdrop to their conversation. Charles found himself stealing glances at Maria, noticing things he had never paid attention to before. The calm way she carried herself, the quiet strength in her posture, the determination that had saved his life. For years, she had been a constant presence in his home, and yet he realized he knew so little about her. "What about you, Maria?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. She looked at him, her expression curious. "What happens now? After everything that's happened, what do you want?" Maria blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. "What do I want?" she repeated, almost as if testing the words. "I don't know. I've spent so long taking care of this house and everyone in it. I've never really thought about what I want." Charles leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Maybe it's time you did," he said softly. "After what you did last night, you deserve more than just being the one who's always in the background." Her eyes widened slightly at his words, but she quickly looked away. "I don't mind being in the background," she said quietly. "It's where I'm most comfortable." Charles frowned, sensing the weight behind her words. "Maria, you were anything but in the background last night. You showed me what courage looks like, and you made me realize something about myself, something I've been too blind to see." Her gaze snapped back to his, curiosity and caution flickering across her face. "What's that?" she asked hesitantly. He hesitated, the words forming carefully in his mind. "That I've spent years building a life that looks impressive from the outside, but in the moments that mattered most, none of it could save me. You could have walked away, but you didn't. And that means more to me than you know." Maria's expression softened, but she quickly masked it with a small, polite smile. "I'm just glad you're safe," she said, rising to her feet. "That's all that matters." As she walked away, Charles watched her go, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. For years, Maria had been an invisible presence in his life, someone he had taken for granted. But now, as he sat alone on the steps, he couldn't help but wonder what else he had missed about her, and why it suddenly mattered so much. The days following the fire were a blur of activity. Contractors arrived to assess the damage. Insurance agents filed endless paperwork, and workers began the slow process of clearing the charred remains of the mansion. Despite the chaos, an eerie quiet seemed to hang over the estate, broken only by the sound of hammers and the distant voices of the crew. Charles spent much of his time in the temporary office set up in the guest house, going through documents and attempting to bring some semblance of order back to his life. But no matter how much he tried to distract himself with logistics and schedules, his mind kept drifting back to Maria. Her voice, her determination, her unwavering bravery. Those moments from the fire played on repeat in his thoughts, refusing to let him go. One afternoon, as he reviewed a stack of blueprints, Charles found himself staring at the papers without really seeing them. His pen hovered over the page, but his mind was elsewhere. He realized with a start that he didn't know much about Maria beyond her work. For 10 years, she had been a constant presence in his home, yet she was still a mystery. Who was she really? What had driven her to risk her life for him that night? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps approaching the office door. He looked up to see Maria standing there, her hands clasped in front of her, a hesitant expression on her face. "Mr. Whitman," she said softly, then caught herself. "I mean, Charles. May I speak with you for a moment?" Charles straightened in his chair, setting his pen down. "Of course, Maria. Come in." She stepped into the room, her movements careful and deliberate. Her usual air of quiet confidence seemed replaced by something more vulnerable, and Charles felt a flicker of concern. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Maria hesitated, glancing down at her hands. "I just wanted to thank you," she said after a moment, "for everything you've done for the staff since the fire. You didn't have to go out of your way to make sure everyone was taken care of." Charles frowned slightly. "Maria, that's the least I could do after everything that's happened. But I feel like I should be the one thanking you. You saved my life, and I haven't properly acknowledged that yet." Maria looked up at him, her dark eyes meeting his. For a moment, she seemed about to speak, but then she shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You've already thanked me, Charles. That's more than enough." "It's not," he said firmly. "You risked everything for me, Maria. I can't just let that go without understanding why." Her smile faltered, and she shifted uncomfortably. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said simply, but her voice wavered slightly, betraying the deeper truth beneath her words. Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Maria, you've worked for me for 10 years. You've always been there, quietly making sure everything runs smoothly. And I've taken that for granted. But after what you did, I can't ignore the fact that there's so much about you I don't know. So I'm asking, why did you come back for me? Why risk your life when you didn't have to?" Maria's hands tightened around the edge of her apron, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Because I couldn't leave you," she said softly. "I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Charles studied her, trying to piece together the emotions she seemed to be holding back. "Maria," he said gently, "there's more to it than that, isn't there?" She looked up sharply, her eyes wide. For a moment, she seemed to struggle with herself, torn between staying silent and letting the truth slip free. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "Charles, I've cared about you for a long time, not just as someone I work for, but as someone I admire." Charles blinked, her confession catching him completely off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Maria, the woman who had been such a quiet, constant presence in his life, was standing before him with a vulnerability he had never seen before. "I know I shouldn't feel this way," she continued quickly, her voice trembling. "I know it's not my place. But after what happened, I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." "Maria," Charles said softly, rising from his chair. He took a step toward her, but she backed away, shaking her head. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I shouldn't have said anything. Please, just forget I said it." "Wait," Charles said, his voice firm but gentle. "Don't go." He stopped a few feet away from her, his hands at his sides. "You don't need to apologize, Maria. I didn't realize." She looked at him, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "Didn't realize what?" she asked hesitantly. "That I've been blind," he admitted. blind to how much you've done for me, how much you've cared, and blind to the fact that I've relied on you more than I ever realized." Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away, forcing a small, trembling smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "But I don't expect anything to change." Charles frowned. "Why not?" he asked. "Why do you think nothing can change?" "Because I don't belong in your world," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just the maid." "No," he said firmly, his tone surprising even himself. "You're not just anything, Maria. You're the person who saved my life. And I'm not going to forget that." She stared at him, her breath catching at his words. But before either of them could say more, the sound of a knock at the door broke the moment. Maria quickly stepped back, her walls going up again. "You should get back to work," she said, her voice calm but distant. "Thank you for listening." And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Charles standing there, his heart heavy with the weight of her confession and the realization that his life had just changed in a way he wasn't prepared for. The evening air was thick with the scent of freshly watered flowers as Charles paced the balcony of a guest house. Below him, the garden lights cast a soft glow over the estate, illuminating the edges of the ruins that once made up his grand mansion. Yet, his eyes weren't focused on the charred remains of his home. His thoughts were consumed by Maria, her confession, her vulnerability, and the raw emotion in her voice as she admitted what she had kept hidden for years. He replayed her words over and over. "I've cared about you for a long time, not just as someone I work for, but as someone I admire." The memory of her trembling hands and the way she had avoided his gaze struck him harder than he wanted to admit. It wasn't just her courage during the fire that stayed with him. It was her courage in exposing her heart to him. For most of his life, Charles had prided himself on his independence, on building an empire without relying on anyone. But Maria had quietly been there all along, holding together the pieces of his life in ways he hadn't even noticed. And now that he saw her clearly, he couldn't unsee her. Determined to break the tension that had grown between them, Charles sought her out. He found her in the garden, kneeling beside a bed of roses that had miraculously survived the fire. Her hands moved methodically, pulling weeds and trimming stray branches, but her posture was tense, as if she were trying to lose herself in the task. "Maria," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, her expression guarded but polite. "Charles," she replied, standing and brushing dirt off her hands. "Do you need something?" He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start. "I need to talk to you," he said finally. "If you have a moment." Maria glanced at the roses, then back at him. "Of course," she said, though her tone was cautious. "What's on your mind?" Charles gestured toward a nearby bench. "Walk with me," he asked. She hesitated, but then nodded, falling into step beside him as they made their way down the garden path. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words that neither seemed ready to voice. After a few minutes, Charles broke the quiet. "Maria, I've been thinking about what you said, about how you feel." Her steps faltered, but she quickly recovered, keeping her eyes fixed ahead. "I shouldn't have said anything," she murmured. "I don't want things to be awkward between us." "It's not awkward," Charles said quickly. "At least, not for me. If anything, it's made me realize how much I've overlooked about you, about everything you've done for me." Maria finally stopped walking, turning to face him. "Charles," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "you don't have to say that. I know my place. I know what people will think if they find out." "Stop," he interrupted, his voice firmer than he intended. He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "Maria, you're not just the maid. You're not invisible. And you're certainly not someone who should think of herself as less than anyone else." She looked away, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her apron. "It's not that simple," she said softly. You have a life, a world that I don't fit into. I've always been okay with staying in the background. It's where I belong." Charles frowned, her words striking a chord of guilt within him. How many years had he allowed her to feel like that? Like she was destined to remain in the shadows, unnoticed and unappreciated? "Maria," he said, his voice gentler now, "you've spent so much of your life taking care of others. But who's taking care of you?" Her eyes snapped back to his, wide with surprise. "I don't need anyone to take care of me," she said quickly. "I've managed just fine on my own." "But you shouldn't have to," Charles replied. "You've given so much of yourself to this house, to me, and I've taken it for granted. I'm sorry for that, and I don't want to keep making the same mistake." Maria's lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time, she seemed genuinely unsure of how to respond. "Charles," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "why does this matter so much to you now, after all these years?" "Because I almost lost you," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "That night, in the fire, I realized how much I've taken for granted. Not just the house or the things I've built, but the people who've been by my side. And you, Maria, you've been more than I ever realized." Her breath hitched, and she quickly looked away, blinking back tears. "I don't know what you expect me to say," she murmured. "I don't expect anything," Charles said gently. I want you to know how much you mean to me. And I want to understand you, Maria. The real you." She hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. "The real me isn't very interesting," she said with a small, self-deprecating smile. "I grew up in a small town, working odd jobs to help my family. When I came here, it was the first time I felt stable, like I could build something for myself. I never wanted to make waves or stand out. I just wanted to do my job and be useful." "You've been more than useful," Charles said firmly. "You've been the glue holding everything together. And if I've made you feel invisible, I'm sorry. That's not how I see you now." Maria looked at him, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "I don't know if I can believe that," she admitted softly. "Then let me prove it to you," Charles said. "Whatever it takes, I'll show you that you're not just someone in the background. You're important, Maria, to me." Her walls, carefully built over years, began to crack as his words sank in. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she wasn't just a supporting character in someone else's story. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "For saying that." Charles offered her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "You've given so much. It's time someone gave back to you." As they stood there, the garden around them bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Maria felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to hope for in years: belonging. And for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved it. The morning air was crisp as Maria stood in the small kitchen of the guest house, her hands deftly slicing fresh fruit for the staff's breakfast. The light streaming through the window framed her figure, and though her movements were practiced and efficient, her mind wandered far from the task at hand. The conversation with Charles the night before had left her shaken, and she replayed his words in her mind like an old record. "You're important, Maria. To me." It was the kind of sentiment she had never allowed herself to hope for. For years, Maria had stayed in the background, blending into the rhythm of the house and finding comfort in the quiet anonymity of her role. But now, Charles had pulled her from the shadows, and she wasn't sure what to do with the light shining on her. As if on cue, the man himself appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the small space. Charles had abandoned his usual tailored suits for a more casual look, rolled up sleeves and slacks, his hair still slightly tousled from sleep. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm but tentative. Maria glanced up, startled, her hand pausing mid-slice. "Good morning," she replied, quickly setting the knife down. "I wasn't expecting you." Charles leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, but his expression soft. "I wanted to check on you," he said simply. "After our talk yesterday, I wanted to make sure you were okay." Maria forced a small smile, busying herself by wiping her hands on a towel. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed the turmoil she felt inside. "Thank you for asking." Charles took a step into the kitchen, his brow furrowing slightly. "Maria, you don't have to pretend with me," he said gently. "I meant what I said last night. I want to know the real you." She froze for a moment, then let out a soft sigh, leaning against the counter. "I don't even know what that means," she admitted. "I've spent so much time taking care of this house, of you, that I've never stopped to think about myself." Charles's gaze softened, and he moved closer, pulling out a chair at the small kitchen table. "Then let's figure out," he said, sitting down. "Tell me about your life, Maria, before you came here." Maria hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the towel. "There's not much to tell," she said, her tone guarded. "I grew up in a small town. My family didn't have much, so I started working young, cleaning houses, doing odd jobs. Eventually, I moved here, looking for something stable. This job gave me that." Charles nodded, leaning forward slightly. "And what about your dreams?" he asked. "What did you want for yourself?" Maria let out a soft laugh, but it was tinged with sadness. "Dreams weren't something I could afford," she said. "When you're just trying to get by, you don't think about what you want. You think about what you need." Her words hit Charles harder than he expected. He had spent his life chasing his ambitions, building a legacy, and surrounding himself with the best the world had to offer. Yet here was Maria, who had spent her life sacrificing her own desires to survive. "You deserve more than that," he said quietly. Maria looked at him, her expression a mix of surprise and doubt. "It's kind of you to say that," she replied softly. "But I'm not sure it's true." "It is," Charles insisted. "You've given so much of yourself to others. Don't you think it's time someone gave back to you?" Maria's eyes dropped to the floor, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to shield her heart. "I wouldn't even know where to start," she whispered. Charles stood, his movements slow and deliberate, as if not to startle her. "Then let me help," he said. "You've spent so long taking care of me and this house. Let me take care of you for a change." Maria's breath caught, and she looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "Charles, you don't have to do that," she said. "I've been fine on my own, but you shouldn't have to be," he replied. "You've been strong for so long, Maria. It's okay to let someone else carry the weight." The vulnerability in his voice was something Maria hadn't expected, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that he meant every word. But the doubts crept back in, whispering that she didn't belong in his world, that this was all too good to be true. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I belong in the life you're offering." Charles reached out, his hand brushing hers in a gesture that was both comforting and grounding. "Maria," he said softly, "you belong anywhere you choose to be. And if you choose to be here, with me, then that's all that matters." Her walls cracked just a little at his words, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why does this matter to you?" "Because you matter," Charles said without hesitation. "You've always mattered. I just didn't see it before. But now, I can't ignore it." Maria stared at him, her heart pounding as his words sank in. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he truly saw her for who she was. But years of hiding in the background had taught her to be cautious, to protect herself from disappointment. "Let me prove it to you," Charles said, his voice steady. "Let me show you that you're more than just someone who works for me. You're someone who's changed my life in ways I never expected." Maria's lips trembled, and for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. "All right," she whispered, "but I don't know how to do this." "You don't have to know," Charles said, a small smile breaking through his seriousness. "We'll figure it out together." The weight in Maria's chest lifted just slightly, replaced by a flicker of warmth she hadn't felt in years. As they stood in the quiet kitchen, the world beyond the guest house seemed to fade away, leaving only the fragile beginnings of something new. The days that followed were a delicate dance between routine and change. The estate, once a symbol of Charles's control and order, now stood as a chaotic construction site. Workers moved in and out, clearing debris and laying the foundation for what would become a new version of his home. But amidst the noise of hammers and saws, an unspoken tension lingered between Charles and Maria, like a thread stretched taut, ready to snap. Maria kept herself busy, her hands always occupied with tasks that seemed to multiply by the hour. Yet no matter how much she tried to bury herself in work, she couldn't escape the memory of Charles's words. "You matter. You've always mattered." They haunted her, stirring something deep within her, a mix of hope and fear that left her feeling unsteady. Charles, on the other hand, was wrestling with his own thoughts. For years, he had built his life around an image of success, surrounding himself with wealth and status that had once seemed unshakable. But the fire had stripped everything down to its core, revealing truths he could no longer ignore. And one of those truths was Maria. The woman he had once taken for granted now occupied his every thought, her quiet strength and unwavering loyalty drawing him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It was late afternoon when Charles found himself standing on the balcony of the guest house, his gaze fixed on the workers below. He was lost in thought when he spotted Maria walking across the garden, her arms full of freshly laundered linens. She moved with her usual grace, but there was a tension in her posture, as if she were carrying more than just the weight of the fabric. Without thinking, Charles descended the stairs and intercepted her near the garden's edge. "Maria," he called softly, his voice carrying over the hum of activity. She paused, her eyes widening slightly as she saw him approach. "Charles," she said, adjusting the linens in her arms. "Is something wrong?" He shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "No, nothing's wrong. I want to talk to you." Maria hesitated, her grip tightening on the linens. "Talk about what?" she asked cautiously. Charles gestured to a nearby bench beneath the shade of a large oak tree. "Will you sit with me for a moment?" he asked. "I promise I won't keep you long." She glanced at the linens, then back at him, clearly torn. But something in his expression softened her resistance, and she nodded. Setting the linens down on a nearby table, she followed him to the bench and sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distant sound of hammers and drills filled the silence, but the weight of their unspoken words hung heavy between them. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "Maria," he began, his voice steady but gentle, "I know you've been trying to act like everything is normal, but I can see it in your eyes. You've been carrying something heavy since the night of the fire." Maria's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I don't know what you mean," she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. "I think you do," Charles replied. "You've been avoiding me ever since that night, and I can't stop thinking about what you said about how you feel." Her breath hitched, and she shook her head. "I shouldn't have said anything," she murmured. "It was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," Charles said firmly, leaning closer. "Maria, I need you to understand something. That night changed everything for me. You didn't just save my life. You made me realize how blind I've been. Blind to what really matters." Maria's hands trembled slightly, and she clenched them together to steady herself. "Charles," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're saying these things now, but what happens when the house is rebuilt? When your life goes back to normal, you'll move on, and I'll go back to being invisible." His chest tightened at her words, and he reached out, covering her hands with his own. "You're not invisible," he said, his voice laced with emotion. "You never were. I was just too caught up in my own world to see it. But now I can't unsee you, Maria. I don't want to." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "But we're from different worlds," she said, her voice cracking. "People will talk. They'll judge you. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to face that." "Let them talk," Charles said firmly. "Let them judge. None of that matters to me. What matters is how I feel about you, and what you mean to me. And I'll face whatever comes, as long as you're willing to stand beside me." Maria's resolve cracked, and a single tear slid down her cheek. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why does this matter so much to you?" "Because you matter," Charles said, his voice steady. "Because you've shown me what love looks like, real, selfless love. And I don't want to spend another day pretending that doesn't mean everything to me." For a long moment, Maria didn't respond. She simply stared at him, her heart pounding as his words sank in. Slowly, she let out a shaky breath, her walls finally crumbling. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared of what this could mean, of what could happen." Charles smiled gently, his hands still covering hers. "It's okay to be scared," he said. "I'm scared too, but I'd rather face that fear with you than live a life without you." Tears streamed down Maria's face as she nodded, a soft, trembling smile breaking through her uncertainty. "Okay," she whispered, "but I don't know how to do this." "We'll figure it out," Charles said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Together, as they sat beneath the oak tree, the world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them and the fragile beginnings of something new. For the first time in years, Charles felt a sense of peace, and Maria felt a flicker of hope. And in that moment, they both knew that their lives had changed forever. The evening sun hung low on the horizon, casting a golden glow across the estate. The reconstruction of the mansion had made progress, but the emotional landscape between Charles and Maria was still fragile, a delicate balance between hope and uncertainty. Maria had agreed to take a step forward, to let herself trust in Charles's words, but the weight of her insecurities lingered like a shadow. She sat on the porch of the guest house, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, staring out at the workers as they packed up for the day. The hum of drills and the clanging of tools had been her background noise for weeks, but tonight it seemed quieter, the silence between bursts of sound amplifying her thoughts. Could this, whatever this was between her and Charles, truly survive the world they lived in? Could she survive it? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the gravel path. She looked up to see Charles approaching, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened, a rare vulnerability in his appearance. He had spent the day overseeing the construction plans, but now seemed to have only one focus, her. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Maria hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Of course," she said, her tone measured but kind. Charles sat down, letting out a quiet sigh as he leaned back in the chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the stillness of the evening stretching between them. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "You've been distant," he said gently. "I can see it in the way you avoid my eyes, the way you keep yourself busy. Maria, if this is too much for you—" "It's not that," she interrupted quickly, her voice trembling. "It's not that I don't care about you. I do. That's what makes this so hard." Charles turned to her, his gaze steady. "Then tell me," he said. "Tell me what's going on in your head." Maria took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the cup in her hands. "I'm scared, Charles," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of what this means, of how people will see us, of how I'll see myself." "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I've spent my whole life being invisible, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I've worked hard, stayed in the background, done everything I could to make sure people didn't notice me. And now, with you, it feels like stepping into a spotlight I'm not ready for. Charles's chest tightened at her words. He had always known Maria as the quiet, dependable presence in his home, but now he saw the years of insecurity and self-doubt she had carried. Maria, he said softly, you've spent so much of your life making sure everyone else is okay. But who's been there for you? She blinked, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. No one, she admitted. I've always been on my own, and I've been fine with that. But now, you're asking me to be something I don't know how to be. I'm not asking you to change who you are, Charles said firmly. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you, to let me be the person who sees you for everything you are, strong, courageous, kind. You're not invisible to me, Maria. You never were. Her breath hitched, and she looked away, the tears finally spilling over. You make it sound so easy, she said, her voice trembling. But it's not. The world isn't kind to people like me, Charles. To people like us. Then we'll face it together, he said, his voice steady. Whatever comes, whatever anyone says, we'll face it together. Maria turned back to him, her gaze searching his face for any hint of doubt. But all she saw was sincerity, a determination that made her chest ache. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice breaking. Why does this matter so much to you? Because I care about you, Charles said simply. Because you've changed my life in ways I didn't even realize I needed. You've been my anchor, my strength, even when I didn't see it. And now, I want to be that for you. Maria shook her head, a small, disbelieving laugh escaping her lips. I don't know if I deserve that, she whispered. You do, Charles said, reaching out to take her hand. You deserve more than you've ever allowed yourself to believe. And if it takes the rest of my life to show you that, then so be it. The silence that followed was heavy, but not with tension. It was filled with the weight of unspoken emotions, of walls breaking down and hearts finding common ground. Maria looked down at their joined hands, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't know how to do this, she admitted softly. I don't know how to let myself hope. Then we'll take it one step at a time, Charles said, his thumb brushing gently against her hand. There's no rush, Maria. Just know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. She let out a shaky breath, a small, tentative smile breaking through her tears. You're stubborn, she said, her voice tinged with a hint of humor. I've been told that before, he replied, with a soft chuckle. But I'm not giving up on you, Maria. Not now. Not ever. For the first time, Maria felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, delicate thing, but real nonetheless. She nodded slowly, her smile growing just a little. All right, she said, one step at a time. Charles smiled back, the tension in his chest easing as he saw the change in her expression. One step at a time, he repeated, his voice filled with quiet determination. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the state in shades of gold and orange, they sat together in silence. It wasn't a silence of uncertainty, but of understanding, a moment of peace in a world that was still rebuilding itself, much like the two of them. For the first time, Maria allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. And for Charles, the realization was just as profound, that in Maria, he had found something far more valuable than the wealth or success he had spent his life chasing. The day dawned with a sense of anticipation that Maria couldn't quite place. The mansion reconstruction was nearing completion, and the workers were adding the final touches to the structure that once symbolized Charles's unshakable empire. Yet, as she stood on the balcony of the guest house, watching the sunlight dance on the dew-covered garden, she realized the change was not just in the house. It was in her. For years, Maria had moved through life as if on autopilot, content to remain in the background. But now, standing on the brink of something new, she felt a strange mix of fear and hope. Charles's words from their last conversation echoed in her mind. "You're not invisible. You never were." Could she really believe that? Could she truly step into a life where she was seen, valued, and cared for, not just as an employee, but as a person? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Before she could respond, Charles stepped in, his presence filling the room with an easy confidence that had always been a part of him. But today, there was something different, a softness in his expression, a quiet determination that made her heart skip a beat. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm. "Good morning," she replied, brushing her hands on her apron out of habit. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, stepping closer. "There's something I want to show you." Maria tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What is it?" she asked. Charles held out his hand, a small, inviting smile on his lips. "Come with me," he said simply. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand in his, the gesture both familiar and new. He led her down the path toward the garden, the morning air crisp and filled with the soft chirping of birds. As they walked, Maria noticed the changes that had been made, the freshly planted flowers, the neatly trimmed hedges, the restored pathways. It was beautiful, but she couldn't help but wonder where he was taking her. Finally, they stopped at the edge of the garden, where a new gazebo stood, its white pillars gleaming in the sunlight. The structure was simple but elegant, adorned with vines of blooming roses that filled the air with their sweet scent. In the center of the gazebo was a small table set for two, complete with fresh flowers and a pot of tea. Maria's breath caught as she took in the scene. "Charles, what is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to her, his gaze steady. "It's a new beginning," he said. "For the house, for the garden, and for us." Her chest tightened, a mix of emotions welling up inside her. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. "It's beautiful." But nothing," Charles interrupted gently. "Maria, you've spent so much of your life making things beautiful for everyone else. It's time someone did the same for you." She looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Then don't say anything," he said with a small smile. "Just sit with me." He led her to the table and pulled out a chair for her, his gestures uncharacteristically thoughtful. As she sat down, he poured her a cup of tea, his movements calm and deliberate. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of construction. "Maria," Charles began, breaking the quiet. "I've spent the past few weeks thinking about everything that's happened. The fire, the rebuilding, the conversations we've had, and it's made me realize something important." She looked at him, her hands wrapped around the warm teacup. "What's that?" she asked softly. "That I don't want to go back to the way things were," he said. "I don't want to live in a house where you feel invisible. I don't want to go through life without acknowledging how much you mean to me. You've changed everything, Maria, and I don't want to lose that." Her heart pounded at his words, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite organize. "Charles," she began, her voice trembling, "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this, for what it means." "I know," he said, his tone gentle. "And I'm not asking for everything to change overnight. But I want you to know that I'm here, that I see you, and I value you, not just for what you do, but for who you are." Tears spilled over her cheeks, and she quickly wiped them away, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "You always seem to know exactly what to say," she said, her voice filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "That's because I mean it," he replied, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Maria, you've spent so much of your life taking care of everyone else. Let me take care of you." Let me show you that you deserve to be seen, to be loved, and to have a place where you belong." Her walls, carefully built over years of self-preservation, crumbled under the weight of his sincerity. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't just in the background, a future where she could stand beside Charles, not as his employee, but as his equal. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "But only if we take it one step at a time." Charles smiled, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "One step at a time," he agreed. "That's all I ask." As they sat together in the gazebo, the sun rising higher in the sky, the world around them seemed to fade away. It wasn't just the beginning of a new chapter for the estate, it was the beginning of something far more profound. And for the first time in years, both Charles and Maria felt a sense of peace, knowing that together they could face whatever the future held. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.